I was only 12, yet swathed in the suffocating grandeur of red velvet and golden threads, the gown pressing down on me with the unyielding weight of chains. My gaze, restless and unwilling to settle, kept slipping toward the golden cord knotted to the foot of the bed. And there, dangling at its end, a small bell. Tonight, that bell was the arbiter of my fate. If it rang, the world would nod in quiet approval, the ritual complete, the union unbreakable. But if it stayed silent, the dawn would not bring me freedom. It would bring shame, questions, and an ending so dark I dared not let my mind wander to its shape. Then, a long, aching creak. The door opened, not in haste, but with the slow deliberation of someone who wanted each sound to stretch. Footsteps followed, heavy yet certain, each one whispering the truth I already knew. My destiny had arrived. I cast my eyes downward, but the bell remained in my mind, shimmering in the corner of my vision. This night did not belong to me. It was an offering, a price paid for an empire's ambitions. And deep inside, I knew, when that bell's soft chime broke the air, my childhood would shatter with it, never to return. The chill of the stone floor slithered up her bare feet, like an icy serpent winding its way into her bones. On the castle walls, ancient tapestries swayed ever so slightly in the breath of a hidden draught, their shadows stretching long and low, crawling across the stones as though something alive was moving within the walls. The torchlight flickered, one moment stretching tall, as if drawing in a deep breath, the next shrinking back, as if some unseen presence had leaned close and blown upon it. The room held a silence unlike any other, the kind that comes when everything stops, poised, holding its breath for a single moment to arrive. In the center of the chamber stood Matilda, only 12 years old, yet wrapped in the grandeur of a queen. The heavy red velvet gown, embroidered with golden thread, clung to her slight frame like the weight of chains. The belt at her waist was so tightly fastened she could breathe only in careful, measured sips. Her heart did not simply beat, it pounded like a blacksmith's hammer striking iron. Each thud struck the stone walls and returned as an echo, layered with yet another shade of fear. Her gaze kept drifting toward the thin golden cord tied to the foot of the bed. At its end hung a small bell, the bell that, if it rang tonight, would mean the ritual was complete. But if it did not, the dawn would not bring her freedom, but disgrace, questions, and an end she dared not even imagine. Then, Kriak. The door began to open, slowly, deliberately, as though someone wished to draw out every sound. The darkness behind it shifted, and a shadow slid into the room. Along with it came a mingled scent: wine, rain-soaked leather, and old iron. The footsteps that followed were slow but certain, each one speaking without words. I am the master. This is my room. This moment is mine. He entered, Henry V, twice her age, his face marked by the scars of war, and his eyes carrying the unyielding hardness of a man long accustomed to command. He spoke no word, yet his silence pressed heavier than speech. Step by step he advanced, and Matilda felt the walls drawing closer, the air thinning around her. She lowered her gaze, but the image of the bell remained burned into her vision. She knew that tonight her fate would not be decided by vows or blessings, but by the faint chime of that bell. The chill of the chamber, the stillness of the bell, and the sound of Henry's steady steps all blurred together before her eyes. Then, with a single breath, the moment shattered, and her mind was flung backward through the years, back to the day she first entered the world. The year was 1102. In the royal palace of England, The first pale light of morning had only just spilled into the courtyard when the bells began to toll. Long, deep, and triumphant. A princess had been born. In the great hall, the air was alive with hurried footsteps. Maids darted through the corridors, midwives carried a tiny, swaddled bundle, and voices mingled in a flurry of congratulations. Yet, amid the bustle, one figure remained still, King Henry I. A faint smile curved his lips, but in his eyes there flickered something far sharper than joy. It was not pride that shone there, but calculation, cold, deliberate. He turned his gaze toward his ministers, as if speaking without words. "This daughter is not my gift. She is my weapon." From the very start, Matilda knew nothing of the world other children called their own. Her chamber overflowed with fine silks, shimmering gold threads, and the scents of rare herbs. Yet beyond the tall windows, there was no meadow to run through, no unguarded freedom. She was given dolls, yes, but their gowns mirrored the stately fashions of the court, and her games followed rules plucked straight from the pages of the royal code. By the time she was 7, Matilda could recite her prayers in Latin with flawless precision, dine with a knife and fork instead of a simple spoon, and bow with graceful ease before princes and kings old enough to be her grandfathers. What she did not yet grasp was that every lesson, every posture, every polished word was meant for a single purpose, so that one day, when she stood before a stranger in a foreign land, she would smile and say nothing. There was an old nurse in the palace who often bent close to her ear, her voice a low rustle. "Princess, there is a whisper of history in your lullaby. One day, that whisper will turn into a command, and when it does, you will not do what you wish, but what the empire demands." At the time, Matilda had laughed softly, thinking it all part of some private game between them. But now, standing in the cold chamber of this castle, the shadow of the bell stretching across the floor, she understood, with aching clarity, exactly what the nurse had meant. The year was 1109. The gates of the royal palace of England swung wide, and with the sharp breath of winter came ambassadors cloaked in heavy, gleaming folds. They brought with them chests of silver, treasures glittering under torchlight, and letters steeped in the scent of hot wax, each one sealed with the mark of a king. As they crossed the threshold into the great hall, the sound of their boots striking the stone floor echoed like the pen strokes of a decree being written into the bones of the castle itself. The ministers traded quiet, knowing glances. No one needed to speak. This was not diplomacy. This was a bargain. Its name was Henry V, sovereign of the Holy Roman Empire. A man in his 20s, his shoulder worn by the weight of a sword, his face carved with the scars of battle. The master of Europe's mightiest realm, he looked at the world as though it were a vast game board, its lands, armies, and women nothing more than pieces to be moved at will. When the marriage proposal was laid before the court, the ceremonial phrases and measured courtesies masked a truth that was plain to all. This was not love, it was alliance, a bridge between two crowns, and Matilda, still a child, would be the first to set foot upon it. Utrecht, April 10th, 1110. The bells rang out across the city, their deep voices mingling with the shimmer of the court, where silks glowed and jewels caught the light like captured stars. In the great hall, at a table that stretched nearly the length of the chamber, Henry's envoys faced the royal advisers of England. Between them, golden goblets were filled and refilled, and with each deliberate clink of the cups, another unspoken promise took form in the air. At one corner of the table sat Matilda, just 7 years old, draped in a gown of deep blue silk. Her wide eyes reflected only innocence, though the faces surrounding her were carved with the sharp lines of calculation. She could not yet know that the sealed letters lying upon the table would chart the path of her life from this day onward. When the last signatures were drawn and the wax seals pressed, a sound seemed to ripple through the hall. Not the tone of a bell or the jingle of metal, but something far quieter. A chime of fate, perhaps, that only Matilda's heart could hear. In that instant, she felt as though her very breath had been folded into the parchment itself. Months later, on a cold morning, the castle gates yawned open. Mist draped the sky in a heavy veil, and at the harbor, the sea shifted as though some vast creature beneath its surface had stirred. From the palace came a slow-moving procession. Wagons stacked with royal garments, jewels, and gifts, guards astride their horses, and in the center, a shuttered carriage with curtained windows. Within it, Matilda. Peering through the narrow gap, she watched the world blur. The castle walls faded into the fog, the familiar faces of the court dissolved, and with them, the last threads of her childhood. Her fingers found the small golden cross at her neck again and again, holding it as though it were the final vessel carrying the scent and warmth of home into the unknown. When the ship finally pushed away from the harbor, the very first wave struck with a force that made the entire deck shudder. The air was sharp with salt, the wind snapping against her face like the sting of a whip. Matilda gripped the railing, her knuckles white, while behind her the maids clung to each other to keep their footing. Above, the clouds sagged low and heavy, as though someone had drawn a great curtain across the sky, shutting out the world she had known. At night, in the narrow darkness of the ship's cabin, she would lie still and listen. Far away, the waves broke with a deep, rolling roar, a sound that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, as though it were carrying her farther and farther from the shores of her old life. After many days at sea, the fog at last began to thin, peeling back to reveal a shore. There lay dense, brooding forests, their dark canopies so thick it was as if the land itself guarded ancient secrets. Rising above them, tall cathedrals stretched their spires toward the sky, their bells tolling in a tone sharp and unyielding, a sound with none of the gentle cadence she had known in England. The royal procession moved inland, winding along narrow roads that cut through scattered villages. People emerged from doorways and fields to watch them pass. Their gazes lingered on Matilda, some wide with wonder, others cool with detachment. It was the look of those who understood without needing to be told. This girl was not one of them. She was a piece on the board of empires, moved into place by unseen hands. Upon her arrival in Germany, Matilda was placed in the care of Archbishop Bruno. Life there moved to a rigid rhythm. Morning prayers struck at the same hour each day, midday lessons in language and etiquette, evenings devoted to the practiced rituals of the court. The crisp, angular sounds of the German tongue felt heavy on her lips at first, but she persevered, for she knew that her future would be carved from these very syllables. At night, in the solitude of her chamber, she sometimes caught the faintest stir beyond the wall. Once, she thought it no more than the wind, until the sound stilled, and a whisper drifted through, so low it seemed meant only for another ear in the shadows. "That's her. The wedding night is near." Her heart stumbled in its rhythm. The candlelight wavered, trembling in place, and for a fleeting moment she felt as though her shadow was more afraid than she was. The year was 1114. On a day when the winter winds scoured the streets, the great bells of Mainz Cathedral rang out, their deep voices so powerful that the stone walls themselves seemed to answer. From the rooftops, drops of melting snow fell like slow, heavy beads, but within the cathedral's soaring arches, the hall blazed with the brilliance of flame and gold. Matilda moved beneath the vaulted grandeur of the cathedral, the weight of a red velvet gown pulling at her with every step. Golden threads blazed in the sunlight that streamed through the high windows, each glint catching like fire. The fabric clung heavy against her frame, so laden it felt as if the very earth was conspiring to hold her in place. Upon her head rested a gossamer veil, so fine and light it might have stirred at the faintest breath. Yet in this moment, even it pressed upon her like a burden. The soaring arches above held the glow of hundreds of candles, their flames swaying in the scented haze of incense and crushed herbs. Silk carpets softened the echo of her steps against the stone floor. On either side, German and English courtiers stood in their finery, their gazes locked upon her. In some eyes she saw open curiosity, in others a glimmer of envy, and in a few the sharp, measuring silence of those who understood political games all too well. The wedding rites unfolded in the solemn cadence of Latin. The priest's deep voice rolled through the vaulted space, each syllable echoing from stone to stone. Yet to Matilda, the words were no more than a distant murmur, blurred and indistinct. She knew their meaning well enough. Every phrase was another seal pressed onto the parchment of her life. When Henry V took her hand, his grip was unyielding, not in affection, but in the quiet declaration of possession. He did not meet her eyes. His gaze remained fixed on the priest, as if this union were merely an administrative step in a larger design. The smiles of the courtiers, the thrum of drums, the murmured prayers, all of it was a finely woven curtain, and behind it the truth stood plain. Tonight, the marriage must be consummated. This was not a ceremony for God alone, but for witnesses, so that by morning the union would be known as more than symbolic, sealed not just in law, but in flesh. When the vows were done, a procession formed. Snow drifted from the sky in light, deliberate flakes. Royal guards, their torches casting wavering halos, led the way to the palace. As she stepped through the castle gates, a cold gust caught her, not the welcome of a homecoming, but the first breath of her captivity. They brought her to her chamber. Outside, maids and witnesses waited in their appointed places. In one corner, tied to the bedpost, a small golden bell gleamed in the candlelight. A wordless reminder that the true trial of the night had yet to begin. The chamber lay in the oldest part of the palace, its silence as taut as a battlefield before the charge. Down the long corridor beyond, torches burned steady, but here the candle's flame bent in a single direction, as though leaning toward the figure it awaited. Two maids slipped into the room, their arms burdened with fresh linen. They worked in slow, deliberate motions, stripping the bed, smoothing each crease, and inspecting their work as though the slightest imperfection might carry consequence. Their eyes met now and then, but no words passed between them. In the shadowed corner, another woman shifted the curtain just enough to glimpse the corridor beyond, where two witnesses stood like sentinels, their elongated shadows spilling across the wall. Matilda's gaze, restless yet fixed, kept returning to the golden cord tied to the bedpost, to the small bell suspended at its end. It was not a trinket. It was a herald. If it rang tonight, the court would wake to the whisper, "The marriage is complete." If it did not, the dawn would come with suspicion, questions, and disgrace. Then, the slow, deliberate groan of hinges. The door opened. Henry V stepped inside. His tread was firm, his bearing absolute. There was no joy in his face, no hint of tenderness, only the cold, unshaken composure of a ruler who had long been master over every room he entered. His eyes swept across the chamber before settling upon Matilda. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. The candle's flame froze in place, the air itself seemed to hold, and the bell remained mute. Matilda felt her own heart falter. Her fingers clutched the silk folds of her gown, gripping them like a shield between herself and what was to come. Henry moved closer. His shadow fell over her face, and the bell caught a flash of light. Then, a chime. Faint, almost imagined, yet it rippled outward as if the stone itself carried the sound. Beyond the curtain, one of the witnesses gave the smallest of nods, a gesture that said, without words, "The proof is there." The room fell silent once more, but it was no longer the same silence. This was a silence with weight, a proclamation, a seal pressed into the wax of history. Matilda closed her eyes. The faint chime of the bell still circled in her ears, a ghost of sound that marked the precise moment her childhood had ended, and a new life, one stripped of her will, had begun. Morning came, though for Matilda the night had not truly passed. The muted echo of that chime lingered within her, as if someone had locked the sound deep inside her soul. By daylight, a different figure stood in the great hall of the castle, Empress Matilda. A heavy crown rested upon her head, a jeweled necklace gleamed at her throat, and on her face was the carefully cultivated smile only royalty could master. A smile that revealed neither joy nor grief, but masked itself entirely in the language of power. The courtiers closed in around her. Some bent low in formal reverence, others murmured ceremonial blessings, and a few regarded her with eyes that hid their questions. Was the ritual fulfilled? No answer came in words, but the subtle shift in posture and tone told her that everyone already knew. Life in the German court resumed its measured pulse. Ceremonies, audiences with diplomats, banquets of rigid grandeur. The rules here were iron-bound. Every glance was measured, every movement assessed, every word given weight and meaning. Matilda learned quickly. She learned when to speak and in what tone, when to remain silent, and when to let a small, enigmatic smile unsettle even her most guarded opponents. But when night descended, the castle's long corridors emptied of life, and she returned to the solitude of her chamber. The torchlight shivered across the stone, and the shadows swelled, looming closer with each flicker. The bell, long since removed from the bedpost, still rang in her mind. Each imagined chime was a reminder. The first great choice of her life had never been hers to make. And perhaps the next would not be either. Months slipped by, and still no news came. The silence was soon filled by murmurs. Perhaps the Queen is weak. Perhaps it is not God's will. Perhaps this alliance will amount to nothing. Each whisper pricked at her like a thorn, sharp and deliberate. Matilda understood that the absence of an heir was not merely a private grief. It was a fault line in the foundation of power. An empire without an heir was an empire in peril. And in peril, allies did not remain allies for long. They became predators. In time, she learned to make silence her ally. She sat through councils and banquets, with the stillness of stone, listening, measuring, storing every word. She spoke sparingly, but when she did, it was with precision, a single phrase that could halt a room. Her eyes missed nothing. She had come to understand that a throne alone did not grant power. True power lay in knowing exactly whom to strike, when to strike, and how to make the blow land so cleanly that no one could trace the hand that dealt it. The year was 1125. The bells of the castle tolled, but their voices were not triumphant now. They spoke of mourning. In the royal palace of Mainz, a cold wind wound its way through the corridors, as if even the stone walls had bowed beneath an invisible weight. Henry V lay in bed, his breaths ragged and uneven. Matilda sat at his side, yet the gulf between them remained, the same unspoken distance that had existed since the first day of their marriage. She searched his face, but the keen light she had once seen there, on the battlefield, in the council chamber, had faded. It was the first time she had seen Henry fragile, and she knew it might be the last. Outside, snow drifted in slow, soundless sheets. Pale winter light spilled through the window, pooling across the cold stone floor. Henry drew in one final breath, and then the world stilled. No cry marked his passing, no grand, tragic flourish. Only silence, a silence stranger to her than fear. With his death, the court's manner shifted. Those who had bent low in her presence only the day before now turned their eyes away. She was a widow, and in this age, a widow's strength extended only as far as her family name or the children who might carry it on. Matilda had no heir. That fact made her weaker still. Within weeks, her place in Mainz was gone. She was ordered back to England. The voyage was long. Often she stood at the ship's railing, the salt wind tangling her hair, her eyes scanning the endless horizon for something she could not name, and perhaps had never truly expected to find. When at last the ship scraped against English shore, a weight settled in her chest. She returned bearing the title Empress Matilda, but the crown felt heavier now, more burden than honor. It was no longer a symbol of triumph, but a reminder that the most pivotal decisions of her life had always been made by other hands. Upon her return, the English court received her with ceremony, banners unfurled, voices raised in formal welcome, yet to Matilda it all passed in a blur. The warmth in the hall was no more than a facade. She knew her survival, her dignity, would depend entirely on how well she could forge her old wounds into armor. And deep within, that same bell still rang. Faint, but relentless. On her first night back in England, she sat alone in her new chamber. Beyond the window, a light rain fell, each drop tapping against stone in a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed through the walls. She reached out and snuffed the candle, leaving only the faint outline of her own shadow stretched across the wall, distorted, almost as though another woman stood silently in the room beside her. She closed her eyes, but her mind refused to rest. The wedding night returned in sharp fragments. The bell tied to the bedpost, the glint of gold in the firelight, Henry's cold, unflinching eyes. The moment she had understood her life was not her own. Once, that memory had stolen her breath. Now, it returned not as a wound, but as proof. She had survived. The real fear was never pain, she told herself. The real fear was the loss of control. The moment you realize your body, your name, your fate, have all been claimed by someone else's will. She curled her fingers into a fist. If power was not mine, then I will take it back now. Every chapter of her past became a weapon. The political maneuvers she had witnessed at Henry's side, the unyielding codes of the German court, the quiet endurance she had cultivated, all of it was training. She knew now the greatest weapon an enemy could wield was fear. And she would never, under any circumstance, place that weapon in their hands again. In the English court, Matilda rebuilt herself piece by piece. She spoke rarely in councils, but when she did, It was at the exact moment her words could slice through the air and still every voice. She wove alliances in quiet corners, tangled her enemies in their own schemes, and turned whispered rumors into weapons that served her. If anyone dared allude to her wedding night, she would only smile, her eyes steady. That night? That was only my first lesson. Sometimes, before she slept, she would sit at the edge of her bed and listen to the phantom chime of a bell. But now, the sound carried no fear. It was a reminder that the moment meant to shatter her had instead forged her. On the table before her rested a small golden bell, the twin of the one she had seen on her wedding night so many years ago. But this one hung from no cord, bound to no bedpost, and waited for no witness's approval. She lifted it into her palm. In an instant, the old images returned, the cold bite of the stone floor, the flicker of the torchlight, Henry's unblinking eyes, and the faint chime that had once sealed her fate. But tonight, the memory had shifted. The chime no longer whispered of fear. It rang with the echo of power. She spoke softly, as if to someone unseen, her voice carrying the weight of both past and promise. A queen fears her wedding night, because it does not belong to her. I stopped fearing, because I made it mine. She let the bell sway in her hand and rang it gently. The soft chime unfurled into the air, curling through the chamber before rebounding off the stone walls. But this time, it was not the sound of captivity. It was the clear, unshakable proclamation of victory. In the wavering torchlight, her face was composed, solemn, yet touched with quiet satisfaction. Beyond the walls, atop the castle's tower, the wind fell still, as though history itself had paused to mark the moment. Matilda set the bell carefully back upon the table. She crossed to the window and looked out into the darkness that stretched far beyond the keep. A faint smile played across her lips. Her story had not begun on that night long ago, but it was that night that had forged her into the woman whose name would echo through the centuries.